It was Christmas Eve in the small, snow-covered town of Stillwater, Minnesota. A hush had settled over the streets as twinkling lights adorned houses and the muffled crunch of boots on icy sidewalks reminded everyone of the season's magic. Children laughed, carolers sang, and warm homes exuded the scent of cinnamon and pine. For most, it was the happiest night of the year. But for 73-year-old Walter Graves, this Christmas was nothing short of a cruel mockery. Walter was a retired widower who had spent most of his life working as a carpenter, building homes for other families while carefully saving for his own golden years. His wife, Meredith, had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving Walter to navigate life alone. Despite his loss, Walter maintained a quiet resilience. He found solace in his modest routines, tending to his garden in the warmer months and whittling small wooden ornaments to gift to the children of the neighborhood during the holidays. By his side always was his faithful companion, Blue, a pit bull with a steel-gray coat and amber eyes that gleamed with intelligence. Walter had adopted Blue 3 years ago after spotting the young dog trembling in a corner at the local shelter. Abandoned and deemed unadoptable by others because of his breed, Blue had found his perfect home with Walter. They had an unshakable bond, one forged in mutual trust and a shared sense of quiet endurance. But this year Walter's world had unraveled. Just weeks earlier, he had fallen victim to a ruthless scam. A man posing as a representative from a trustworthy investment firm had contacted Walter, promising a high return if he invested his modest savings. The man's voice had been warm, assuring, and patient, traits that lowered Walter's guard. Lonely and eager to make the little he had grow into something more, Walter had given in. The scammers drained every penny he had painstakingly saved, leaving him with nothing. Walter only realized the betrayal when his bank account was completely empty. It wasn't just the money that had been stolen. It was his sense of security, his independence, his ability to weather the years ahead. The humiliation of being deceived so easily gnawed at him like a wound that wouldn't close. Now, as the world around him seemed to glow with festive cheer, Walter sat alone in his drafty living room, clutching a cup of lukewarm tea. Blue lay curled at his feet, his head resting on his paws, as if he could sense his owner's despair. The pair had only a few presents beneath the tree, none of which Walter could afford to buy. His remaining dollars had gone toward keeping the heat on, though even that would run out soon. The worst part, however, wasn't the money. It was the betrayal. Walter replayed the phone calls in his mind, hearing the cheerful reassurances of the man who had taken everything. He felt foolish and angry at himself for believing in someone he didn't know. His heart ached with the weight of it. He couldn't bear the thought of telling anyone in the community what had happened. What would they think of him, a man who had always been so careful and self-reliant? Blue, as if sensing the depth of Walter's sadness, stood and nudged his knee with a cold, wet nose. Walter reached down and absently scratched behind the pit bull's ears, murmuring, "You're all I've got left, buddy." The dog licked his hand in response, his tail giving a small, hopeful wag. But even in his darkest moments, Walter couldn't bring himself to wallow for long. Christmas was tomorrow, and despite everything, he wanted to bring some joy to the children on his street. For the past few weeks, he had been crafting wooden trains, angels, and tiny snowmen to hand out as gifts. He knew he couldn't afford store-bought presents, but the kids had always loved his handcrafted toys, and this year would be no different. He told himself that giving what little he had would make him feel better, even if only for a moment. Little did he know, his act of quiet generosity would set the stage for a chain of events that would forever alter his life, and Blue's role in what was about to unfold would become the stuff of local legend. As the evening deepened, Walter rose from his chair and placed the small pile of wooden toys into a worn wicker basket. Blue followed him, wagging his tail as Walter donned his old wool coat and hat. Snowflakes began to swirl outside as they stepped onto the porch, the icy air biting at Walter's cheeks. He paused to take in the quiet beauty of the night, the way the snow glistened like diamonds under the glow of streetlights. But just as Walter and Blue began their walk down the street, a sound caught Blue's attention. His ears perked up, his nose twitched, and he let out a low growl, a sound Walter rarely heard from his otherwise gentle companion. "What is it, boy?" Walter asked, his brow furrowing. He followed Blue's gaze toward a sleek black car parked at the corner, its headlights off but its engine quietly running. Blue's growl grew louder, his body tense and alert as he stared at the vehicle. Walter's heart quickened, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was Blue's uncharacteristic reaction, or maybe it was the shadowy figure he could just barely make out sitting in the driver's seat. Something felt off. "Come on, Blue," Walter murmured, tugging gently at the leash. But Blue wouldn't budge. His amber eyes stayed locked on the car, his growl rumbling in his throat like distant thunder. Unbeknownst to Walter, that black car and the man inside it would lead to a Christmas Eve unlike any other. Blue's instincts were sharper than Walter could have imagined, and soon the pit bull would prove that loyalty and love sometimes come in unexpected forms. As Walter tugged again on Blue's leash, urging him to leave the strange car behind, the pit bull let out a sharp bark, one that echoed through the stillness of the snowy night. Startled, Walter turned to scold him softly, but the look in Blue's amber eyes gave him pause. It wasn't aggression, it was something sharper, something focused. All right, Walter muttered, casting a final glance at the car before continuing down the street. Blue reluctantly followed, but he kept glancing back, his body tense as though ready to spring into action. Walter tried to push the odd encounter from his mind. He had more pressing matters to think about, like delivering the toys to the children. They would be asleep soon, dreaming of Santa and presents, and he didn't want to let them down. He made his way to the first house, leaving a small wooden train on the doorstep before moving on to the next. Blue trotted beside him, his earlier unease seeming to fade as they moved farther from the car. But as Walter reached the fifth house, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He had the distinct feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder and froze. The black car was creeping down the street, its tires crunching softly over the snow. The headlights were still off, but there was no mistaking the slow, deliberate pace of the vehicle. "Who on earth?" Walter murmured, gripping Blue's leash tightly. He felt a pang of fear, his mind racing through possibilities. Was it someone from the scam tracking him down? But why would they bother? He had nothing left to take. Blue stopped in his tracks and let out another bark, louder this time. Walter's pulse quickened as the car came to a halt several yards away. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. "Hey," Walter called, his voice trembling slightly. "Can I help you?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he began walking toward Walter with slow, purposeful steps. Walter instinctively took a step back, his grip on Blue's leash tightening. The pit bull growled low and deep, baring his teeth. "Blue?" Walter whispered, "Easy, boy." But his heart was pounding. Something about the man's presence set every nerve in his body on edge. When the man was close enough to be illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby streetlight, Walter's breath hitched. He recognized him. It was the voice on the phone, the same man who had sweet-talked him into handing over his savings. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "You," Walter said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "You're the one who scammed me." The man smirked, pulling his hood back to reveal a face that was both smug and cold. "Smart old man," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But you're not as clever as you think. I just came by to make sure there's no loose ends." Walter felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Loose ends?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out something that glinted in the faint light. Walter's breath caught. Was that a knife? "Look," Walter stammered, his voice thick with desperation. "I don't have anything left. You already took it all. Please, just leave us alone." But the man stepped closer, his smirk never wavering. Blue, sensing the danger, stepped in front of Walter, his body rigid and his teeth bared in a snarl. The pit bull's growl was so fierce, so primal, that even the man hesitated for a moment. "You better call off your mutt," the man said, his smirk faltering slightly. "Wouldn't want anything to happen to him or you." Walter's hands trembled, but he stood his ground. "I won't let you hurt us," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The man lunged forward suddenly, and everything happened in a blur. Blue barked sharply and leapt toward the man, his powerful body colliding with him and knocking him off balance. The knife clattered to the ground as the man fell, cursing loudly. Blue didn't back down. He stood over the man, his growl so menacing that the man froze, his hands raised defensively. "Call him off!" The man shouted, his earlier confidence replaced by panic. Walter stepped forward, his heart pounding as he reached down to grab the knife. He held it awkwardly in his shaking hands, unsure of what to do next. He had never been in a situation like this before. "Blue," Walter said, his voice firm but gentle. "Stay." The pit bull obeyed, backing off slightly but keeping his eyes locked on the man, ready to pounce again if necessary. "You're going to leave," Walter said, his voice trembling but resolute. "And you're not going to come back. Do you understand me?" The man scrambled to his feet, his hands still raised. All right," he said, backing away slowly. "I'm gone. Just keep that beast away from me." Walter watched as the man stumbled back to his car, climbed in, and sped off, his tires skidding on the icy road. Only when the car disappeared from sight did Walter let out the breath he had been holding. Blue turned to look at him, his tail wagging slightly as if to say, "We did it." Walter knelt down and wrapped his arms around the dog, his throat tight with emotion. "You saved me, Blue," he whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." But even as relief washed over him, Walter knew this wasn't over. That man might be gone for now, but what if he came back? What if he tried to hurt someone else? Walter glanced down at the knife in his hand and made a decision. He couldn't let this man keep preying on innocent people. He had to do something, but he wouldn't have to do it alone. Blue was by his side, and together they would find a way to make things right. The quiet of the snowy street had returned, but Walter's heart still thundered in his chest. Blue stood close to him, ears perked and alert, as though ready to leap into action again. Walter stared down at the knife he'd picked up, his breath visible in the freezing air. That man, the scammer, had meant to harm him. Walter had no doubt about that. The thought sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through him. For years he had lived his life with dignity and humility, asking for nothing and doing his best to give back where he could. Now, not only had this man stolen his savings, but he had also tried to intimidate him into silence. Walter clenched his fists, his determination hardening. No, this wasn't how it would end. "Come on, Blue," Walter said, his voice low but steady. The pit bull wagged his tail slightly, sensing his owner's renewed resolve. Walter's first thought was to call the police. He had hesitated earlier, embarrassed to admit that he'd fallen for a scam, but after tonight, he knew he had no choice. He didn't have a cell phone, so he hurried back home, Blue trotting faithfully beside him. As he walked, an idea began to form in his mind, an idea sparked by the presence of Blue and the unique set of skills Walter had as a retired carpenter. When they reached the small, drafty house, Walter set the knife down on the kitchen counter and picked up his landline phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed the local police station. "This is Stillwater Police Department," a calm voice answered. Walter cleared his throat. "Hello, this is Walter Graves. I need to report a crime, a scam, and an attempted assault. It's the same man." The officer on the other end listened patiently as Walter recounted the details of the scam and the events of that night. He described the man, the car, and the knife. The officer assured him that they would look into it, but Walter could hear the doubt in her voice. How much could they really do without solid evidence? After hanging up, Walter slumped into his chair. He felt a pang of frustration, knowing that while the police might try, they didn't have much to go on. Scammers like this man were often slippery, operating under false identities and disappearing before they could be caught. And that's when it hit him. He didn't just have to rely on the police. He had Blue, and Blue had an uncanny nose for danger. Walter stood, suddenly animated. He grabbed a flashlight and motioned for Blue to follow him. The dog barked once, excited, as if sensing that something important was happening. Walter's plan was half-formed, but he trusted Blue's instincts. The black car had been parked at the corner earlier. Maybe, just maybe, there would be a clue nearby. A discarded receipt, a license plate imprint in the snow, anything. The two ventured out into the cold once more, retracing their steps to the spot where the confrontation had occurred. Blue sniffed the ground eagerly, his tail wagging as he picked up scents. Walter watched in amazement as the pit bull followed an invisible trail, his nose leading them to the spot where the car had idled earlier. "Good boy, Blue," Walter murmured, shining his flashlight around. And there it was, a single crumpled piece of paper half buried in the snow. Walter crouched down to retrieve it, his fingers trembling with a mix of cold and excitement. He unfolded the paper carefully, squinting at the faint writing. It was a receipt from a gas station just outside of town. "Blue, you're a genius," Walter said, scratching the dog behind the ears. Blue wagged his tail in response, his tongue lolling happily. The receipt gave Walter a lead and an idea. If the scammer had been at the gas station, there might be surveillance footage. He hurried home with Blue and called the police again, relaying the new information. The officer on duty seemed impressed by Walter's initiative and promised to follow up. But Walter didn't stop there. As the hours ticked by and the town grew quieter, Walter sat in his living room, carving a new wooden toy, but this one wasn't for the neighborhood children. It was a decoy, modeled after the small, handcrafted chest that he had stored his savings in before they were stolen. He placed a note inside that read, "You didn't take everything from me." His plan was simple, yet risky. He would set a trap. Walter was certain the scammer would return, emboldened by his earlier attempt to intimidate him. The decoy chest would be the bait. Blue, his ever-loyal protector, would be the deterrent. It didn't take long for Walter's hunch to be proven right. Just before dawn on Christmas morning, as Walter sat by the window sipping a cup of tea, Blue's ears perked up. The pit bull let out a low growl, his body rigid. Walter followed his gaze and felt his stomach churn. The black car was back. Walter's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He grabbed the decoy chest and placed it near the front door, making sure it was visible through the window. Then he crouched next to Blue, whispering softly, "Stay, boy. Stay." The man emerged from the car, his movements cautious but deliberate. He approached the house, peering through the window and spotting the chest. A triumphant grin spread across his face as he reached for the door handle. But just as the man stepped inside, Blue sprang into action. The pit bull lunged forward, barking ferociously, his powerful body blocking the man's path. The man stumbled backward, his expression twisting from smugness to sheer terror. At that moment, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Walter had called the police the moment he saw the car, and they had arrived just in time. The man bolted for the door, but Blue stayed close on his heels, herding him like a sheepdog until the officers arrived to arrest him. As they cuffed the man and loaded him into the squad car, one of the officers turned to Walter and said, "You've got quite the partner there." Walter smiled down at Blue, his heart swelling with pride. "He's more than a partner," he said. "He's my family." For the first time in weeks, Walter felt something he hadn't in a long time, hope. And it was all thanks to Blue. As the squad car disappeared down the snow-dusted street, Walter stood on his porch with Blue by his side. The pit bull's tail wagged slowly as Walter crouched down to hug him tightly, burying his face in the thick fur at Blue's neck. The tears he'd held back for so long finally spilled over, tears of relief, gratitude, and pride. "You did it, Blue," Walter whispered, his voice cracking. "You saved me. You saved everything." Blue licked his face, his amber eyes sparkling as if he understood the magnitude of what had just happened. For Walter, this was more than just a thwarted crime. It was the moment his faith in himself and the world began to return. The police had promised to follow up with Walter about the scammer, and they were optimistic that the arrest would lead to answers. But for now, Walter allowed himself to feel the small victory, standing there in the quiet morning light with his loyal companion. Christmas Day had arrived, and though the events of the night had left him drained, Walter felt a strange kind of peace settle over him. Later that morning, an officer came by to update Walter. The man they'd arrested had been a part of a larger scam ring operating in the region, preying on elderly individuals like Walter. The receipt Walter and Blue had found had indeed been critical in tracking his movements. "You've done a lot more than protect yourself," the officer said, tipping his hat. "With your help, we might just shut down the entire operation." Walter's chest swelled with pride, not for himself but for Blue. "It wasn't just me," he said, glancing at the pit bull lying contentedly by the fireplace. "I had the best partner anyone could ask for." The officer chuckled, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. "About that partner of yours," he said. "The neighbors have been talking about what happened. They say your dog deserves a medal." Walter laughed softly. "He deserves a whole lot more than that." The news of Blue's heroics spread quickly through the town of Stillwater. By the afternoon, neighbors began arriving at Walter's door, each one carrying something: a hot casserole, a tin of cookies, a knitted scarf. Word of Walter's situation had gotten out, and the community rallied around him in a way that brought tears to his eyes. The Johnson family, whose children adored Walter's wooden toys, brought him a freshly baked pie and stayed to chat by the fire. Mrs. Reynolds, the widow who lived 2 doors down, handed Walter an envelope stuffed with cash and refused to take no for an answer. "It's Christmas, Walter," she said, her eyes kind but firm, "and we take care of our own." Through it all, Blue was the star of the day. The children from the neighborhood gathered around him, petting his soft fur and giggling as he wagged his tail and licked their hands. Walter watched from his armchair, his heart full as he saw the joy Blue brought to everyone who met him. But the most unexpected surprise came that evening. Just as the last rays of sunlight faded into twilight, there was a knock at the door, and when Walter opened it, he was greeted by a man in a neatly pressed suit holding a briefcase. "Mr. Graves?" the man said, extending a hand. "My name is Richard Palmer. I'm a lawyer representing some of the scam victims." Walter's stomach tightened. "I already told the police everything I know," he said cautiously. Palmer smiled gently. "I'm not here about that. I'm here to help you recover what was taken from you." Walter blinked, his mind struggling to process the words. "Recover?" "Yes," Palmer said, stepping inside and opening his briefcase. He pulled out a stack of documents and a check. "The man who scammed you? He's been caught with evidence of all his transactions. The police recovered the funds he stole, and I've been tasked with ensuring the victims are reimbursed. This," he said, holding out the check, "is yours." Walter's hands trembled as he took the check. His breath caught when he saw the number written on it. It was more than he had lost, far more. I don't understand," Walter stammered. Palmer smiled. "There's a restitution fund set up for cases like this. Consider it a small piece of justice for what you've been through." Walter felt his knees go weak. He glanced over at Blue, who was watching from his spot by the fire, his head tilted, as if he understood something extraordinary had just happened. "I don't know what to say," Walter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Say Merry Christmas," Palmer said with a wink. As the lawyer left, Walter sat down heavily in his chair, staring at the check in his hands. He had been prepared to spend the rest of his life scraping by, surviving on the little he had left. Now, for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. But Walter knew this wasn't just about money. It was about what Blue had given him: hope, courage, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's light to be found. That evening, Walter took Blue for one last walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp and cold, the stars glittering like diamonds overhead. Walter's neighbors had left their Christmas lights on, and the soft glow illuminated the snow-covered streets. As they walked, Walter looked down at Blue and smiled. "You're more than a dog, you know that?" he said, his voice soft. "You're a hero." Blue wagged his tail, his breath visible in the frosty air. Walter chuckled, the sound rich with gratitude. When they returned home, Walter lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill. It was a tradition Meredith had started years ago, a way to honor the love and warmth of the season. As the flame flickered, Walter felt her presence beside him, as if she, too, was proud of how far he'd come. Blue curled up at Walter's feet, his body warm and solid against the chill of the room. For the first time in a long while, Walter felt truly at peace. Walter sat by the crackling fire that evening, Blue snoring softly at his feet. The little house felt warmer than it had in years, not because of the fire, but because of everything that had happened. Walter thought back to the fear and despair he had felt just days ago, how he had nearly let the weight of the scam and the betrayal crush him. But Blue had been there through it all. It was Blue who sensed the danger, Blue who had the courage to stand between Walter and the man who tried to harm him. Blue who reminded Walter of the strength he had forgotten he possessed. The small wooden chest, the decoy that had helped set the trap, still sat on the mantel. Walter had decided to keep it there as a reminder, not of what he'd lost, but of what he had gained. This Christmas had tested him in ways he never expected, but it had also shown him the resilience of his spirit, the kindness of his neighbors, and the unbreakable bond he shared with his pit bull. The money he had recovered was a blessing, of course, but it wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the hope it restored, the sense of safety and belonging it rekindled. Walter knew he would use it wisely, not just for himself, but for the community that had shown him such compassion. As the clock struck midnight, Walter reached down and scratched Blue behind the ears. The dog stirred, lifting his head to look at Walter with sleepy, trusting eyes. "Merry Christmas, Blue," Walter whispered. "You're my miracle." Blue wagged his tail, thumping it softly against the rug, and rested his head back on Walter's feet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Stillwater in a layer of fresh, quiet beauty. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the love between an old man and his dog filled the room with a sense of peace that needed no words. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, marking the beginning of Christmas Day. And for the first time in years, Walter felt truly blessed.